Welcome back, everyone, to the Mad Genius Thesis. We keep coming back to this question, don't we? Is there really a link between creativity and mental illness?
Yeah, it's a question that's fascinated people for centuries. And we're not the first to try to tackle it. We're diving into a really interesting book for this deep dive, The Dark Side of Creativity.
Okay, so the title's pretty provocative, right? The Dark Side of Creativity. What's the book's take on this whole thing?
Well, one of the things that jumped out at me is that it doesn't shy away from the less glamorous, even kind of disturbing aspects of creative genius. Like, it really digs into the idea that creativity isn't always this positive sunshine and roses kind of force.
I mean, it's easy to think of creativity as inherently good, right? Art, music, innovation.
Right. But this book pushes us to look deeper, to consider the possibility that there might be a shadow side. It starts off strong, too. Did you know that something like 60% of art and design students might have visual spatial learning differences?
Wow, that's a surprisingly high number, 60%.
Yeah, and it kind of hints at a potential connection between creativity and what some might call outlier thinking.
Which, when you think about it, makes sense. I mean, so many of the creative geniuses throughout history, they kind of marched to the beat of their own drum, right?
Exactly. They saw the world differently, processed information in unique ways. The book also explores how even the best intentions can have unintended consequences.
Interesting. Could you give me an example?
Sure. Take J.S.G. Boggs. You familiar with him? He made these incredibly realistic drawings of banknotes.
I've heard of him. So where's the dark side in that? He was an artist, right?
Right, but his work landed him in legal trouble. See, some people saw it as forgery, even though he never intended to deceive anyone. His case really highlights how the perception of creativity can shift depending on who's doing the judging.
Oh, totally. Like one person's art is another person's crime.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to think about what Boggs's work says about money itself.
Yeah. Is it just paper? A social construct? Boggs really challenges our assumptions.
Definitely makes you think. Okay, so we've got this potential for creativity to be misunderstood, even criminalized in some cases. What other dark sides does the book delve into?
Oh, there's a whole chapter on unintended consequences, like take the development of ball bearings during World War II. Sounds pretty mundane, right?
Yeah, not exactly the most exciting invention.
But the book argues that developing high-quality ball bearings had a massive ripple effect on the war's outcome. They impacted everything from aircraft performance to the ability to produce weapons efficiently.
So a seemingly small innovation had a huge impact.
Yeah, and it highlights how difficult it is to predict the full consequences of any new idea, especially in a complex system like a war.
Makes you wonder if there's any way to fully anticipate the unintended consequences. What about at peacetime?
Oh, there are plenty of examples there, too. The book looks at the early days of nuclear power. Remember, it was initially hailed as this clean, limitless energy source.
Yeah, the miracle of the atom and all that.
Right, but the rush to build nuclear plants led to some, well, pretty major accidents. Think Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island. Suddenly, this miracle technology didn't seem so miraculous anymore.
It's like that old saying, be careful what you wish for.
Exactly, and it raises questions about progress itself. Is it always a good thing? Or can it sometimes lead us down a path we might regret?
Okay, so we've got creativity that's misunderstood, creativity with unintended consequences. What about the classic image of the mad genius? Is there anything to that?
Ah, yes, the tortured artist, the eccentric scientist. That stereotype is as old as time. The book tackles it head on. And it turns out there is some evidence suggesting a connection between creativity and mental illness.
Really? So it's not just a myth?
Well, it's complicated. There are studies that show higher rates of certain mental health conditions among highly creative individuals. But it's not a straightforward cause and effect relationship.
So you can't just say, oh, being creative makes you mentally ill, or vice versa.
Right. The book digs into personality traits that might play a role, like openness to experience. This is like being open to new ideas, willing to explore, step outside your comfort zone.
It makes me think of people who are curious, adventurous, maybe a little unconventional.
Exactly. Those kinds of folks might be drawn to creative pursuits. But that same openness, that willingness to push boundaries, may also make them more sensitive or vulnerable to certain mental health challenges.
Like a double-edged sword.
That's a great way to put it. The book actually uses Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground as an example.
Oh, the underground man. He's definitely a complex character. Brilliant, creative, but also incredibly isolated and anxious.
A perfect example of that inner tension that can exist in a creative mind.
But, I mean, obviously not all creative people are tortured souls, right?
Of course not. It's
Yeah.
important not to oversimplify things. But the book does raise important questions about the potential downsides of a highly creative mind.
It's like creativity can be a source of both great joy and great pain. Innovation that changes the world and unintended consequences that we might not even see coming.
And that's what makes this whole discussion so fascinating. It's not about easy answers. It's about acknowledging the complexities and nuances of the creative process.
Speaking of which, I found it really interesting how the book talks about using creativity to fight crime, this whole design against crime concept.
Oh, yeah, that's a cool field. They're literally using creative problem solving to make crime more difficult, less appealing.
So it's like a proactive approach to crime prevention
Well,
rather than just reacting after the fact.
exactly. It's like, how can we use design principles to deter criminal activity? Think redesigning a public space to make it less inviting for criminals, or developing locks that are harder to pick.
So they're kind of turning the tables, using creativity to outsmart the bad guys.
You got it. It's about understanding the criminal mind and then designing solutions that make them think twice.
Like a mental chess game, but for the good of society.
You could say that. It's about harnessing creativity for the common good. And that brings us back to the idea of social wisdom, which we'll explore more in the next segment.
Okay, can't wait to dig into that. But before we go, I want to circle back to something you mentioned about those unintended consequences. I know the book uses Richard Nixon's Southern strategy as an example.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. It's about how a creative political strategy can have really long-lasting effects, and not always positive ones.
Remind me, what exactly was the Southern strategy?
Well, basically, Nixon's campaign strategists saw an opportunity to tap into racial anxieties in the South. This was during the Civil Rights Movement, and there was a lot of fear and uncertainty swirling around.
So they basically exploited that fear to win votes.
They were very creative in how they did it, that's for sure. And it worked. Nixon won the election.
But at a cost.
Right. It contributed to a deeper polarization in American politics, and the repercussions are still being felt today.
So their creativity kind of backfired.
You could definitely say that. It's a classic example of how a brilliant idea, or at least a clever one, can have a dark side.
Makes you wonder how you define success when it comes to creativity. Is it just about achieving your goals, or is there more to it?
That's a great question, and I think it's one the book is trying to get us to wrestle with. Should we be considering the long-term ethical implications? And who decides what's ethical anyway?
Big questions for sure.
Yeah, and ones we'll dig into more when we talk about wise creativity in our next segment.
Can't wait for that.
But for now, let's shift gears a bit and look at another chilling example: the development of biological weapons. This is where things get really dark, right?
It's definitely a disturbing example of how scientific ingenuity can be used for incredibly destructive purposes. And, the book talks about how the Soviet Union in particular had this massive bioweapons program.
And they had some of the brightest scientific minds in the world working on it, right? It's almost hard to fathom. People with incredible talent and knowledge using it to create weapons that could wipe out entire populations. It's a question that keeps coming up for me. How do brilliant people end up doing such horrific things?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's a complex issue that we'll unpack further in our next segment when we look at how systems and structures can shape creative outcomes.
Okay, I'm definitely looking forward to that. But I think for now, we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive into the dark side of creativity. We've seen how creativity can be a double-edged sword. It's a force for good, but it also has this potential for darkness.
Yeah, and we've just started to scratch the surface of the relationship between creativity and mental illness, which is a topic we'll keep exploring as we go deeper into the book. The Soviet bioweapons program, it's like a real-life horror movie. The book talks about how the government used fear and paranoia to manipulate those scientists. Like, they weren't just driven by ambition. It's chilling to think about. These were brilliant people working on projects that could have had devastating consequences.
And what's even crazier is how the government spun it as patriotism. They made these scientists believe they were protecting their country from some huge, invisible enemy.
It's like they were trapped in a system that was built on secrecy and fear.
Exactly. The book goes into detail about how the regime used surveillance to control those scientists. They couldn't speak out, couldn't question what they were doing.
It makes you think, how do you resist that kind of pressure? To stand up and say, no, this is wrong.
It would take incredible courage. to risk your life, maybe even your family's lives, to go against that kind of system.
It's a reminder that even the most brilliant minds are vulnerable to those forces, those external pressures that can push them in the wrong direction.
You're absolutely right. We often think of geniuses as being above it all, but they're just as susceptible to manipulation as anyone else.
And sometimes those systems can push innovation in directions that have devastating consequences. Like we talked about with nuclear power, the rush to develop that technology led to some pretty serious accidents.
Yeah, the book really highlights how the Cold War anxieties fueled that whole push for nuclear power, and safety concerns often took a back seat.
Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, those are just like stark reminders of what can happen when we prioritize speed over caution.
No doubt about it. And it's not just governments either. The book talks about how corporate competition can also drive innovation in dangerous directions.
Like that pressure to be first to market, to push boundaries without fully understanding the risks.
Exactly. There are so many examples of that, companies cutting corners or overlooking safety protocols just to get ahead.
It makes you wonder, are there times when we need to put limits on innovation?
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to things that could harm people or the environment.
It's a tough question, but I think it's one we have to ask ourselves more and more as technology advances.
And speaking of pushing boundaries, the book brings up Richard Nixon's Southern strategy as an example of how creativity can be used to achieve political goals, even if those goals are, ethically questionable.
That's such a good point. Nixon's strategists, they were incredibly creative in how they used racial anxieties to win votes. But the long-term impact, well, it was pretty devastating.
It's like their creativity backfired, creating a more divided and polarized society.
And those divisions are still with us today. It's a powerful reminder that even when creative strategies are successful in the short term, they can have unintended consequences that ripple out for generations.
It really emphasizes that responsibility that comes with creativity. It's not enough to just have a clever idea. You also have to think about the potential consequences, both good and bad.
You've got to weigh the potential benefits against the potential risks. And that's where wise creativity comes in, which is something the book talks a lot about.
Yeah, it's not just about being creative. It's about being ethical, thoughtful, considering the long-term impact of your actions.
It's about balancing that drive for innovation with a sense of social responsibility.
So it's not just about what you create, but also about why you create it and how you create it.
Absolutely. And that involves developing not just our cognitive skills, but also our moral compass, our sense of empathy.
It makes you wonder, are there ways to actually nurture wise creativity in people? Like, are there things we can do to cultivate that balance?
That's a great question. And luckily, the book offers some ideas. It suggests focusing on education, mentorship, and creating environments that encourage ethical decision-making.
So it's not just about teaching people how to be creative, but also about helping them understand the responsibility that comes with it.
Right. It's about fostering a culture where creativity is celebrated, but not at the expense of ethics or the well-being of others.
Can you give me some specific examples of how education and mentorship could actually work in practice?
Sure. What if, from a young age, we taught kids not just the how-to of creativity, but also the why behind it? Like, what are the potential consequences of your creation? And imagine if mentors, the experienced artists and scientists and entrepreneurs, if they actively guided their mentees to think about the ethical implications of their work.
It's about encouraging them to ask those tough questions. Who might be harmed by this? What could go wrong?
Exactly. It's about fostering a more holistic approach to creativity, one that acknowledges both the benefits and the potential downsides.
So it's about helping young creators to develop not just their skills, but also their conscience.
Their sense of responsibility, their awareness of the larger social context.
And that brings us back to the original question about creativity and mental illness. It seems like the book is saying it's more nuanced than just a simple yes or no.
It's definitely not a black and white issue. The book delves into some research suggesting that certain personality traits might be linked to both creativity and, a higher risk of certain mental health challenges.
It makes me think about what we were talking about before, those outlier thinkers. The ones who are more impulsive, more sensitive, more driven to explore uncharted territories.
Right. And those traits can be both a blessing and a curse, right? They can fuel incredible creativity, but they can also make individuals more vulnerable to certain struggles.
The book also talks about this idea of reframing how we view those traits. Instead of seeing them as inherently negative, maybe we can see them as potential strengths, depending on how they're channeled.
Yeah, like that example with dyslexia and art students. Dyslexia is often seen as a learning disability, but it can also be a different way of thinking, a different way of seeing the world that can be a real asset in creative fields.
Exactly. So it's not about labeling those traits as good or bad. It's about understanding how they can manifest in different ways and how they can be harnessed for positive outcomes.
And I think that reframing can also apply to creativity itself. Instead of viewing it as purely positive, we need to acknowledge that it has this potential for both good and bad outcomes.
Recognizing the dark side doesn't mean demonizing creative people. It means being aware of those potential pitfalls and using our creativity in a more responsible way.
Absolutely. It's about understanding that creativity is a powerful tool, and like any tool, it can be used for good or ill. It all depends on the person wielding it.
And that's where wisdom comes back into play, helping us to use our creative powers, not just to innovate, but to innovate in a way that benefits ourselves and the world around us.
It's about developing not just our creative abilities, but also our ethical awareness, our empathy, our ability to look beyond the immediate and consider the long-term consequences.
So wise creativity is more than just coming up with brilliant ideas. It's about using those ideas in a way that's responsible, ethical, and ultimately for the greater good.
You said it perfectly. It's about recognizing that we have a choice in how we use our creative powers, and that choice matters.
Especially in today's world where innovation is happening at such a rapid pace.
It's more important than ever to be asking ourselves not just, can we do this, but should we do this? And if so, how can we do it in a way that minimizes the risks and maximizes the benefits for everyone?
It's a lot to think about, for sure, but the book gives us a really good framework for navigating these complex issues.
I totally agree. It challenges us to think beyond the surface, to consider the ethical implications of our actions, and to strive for a more balanced and nuanced approach to creativity.
And that brings us to a really interesting example the book gives of how creativity is being used to address a very real problem. Crime. You mentioned this concept of design against crime
Oh,
earlier.
yeah, design against crime.
Yeah.
It's such a cool approach. It's about using design principles to make crime more difficult and less appealing.
So instead of just focusing on punishing criminals after a crime has been committed, it's about trying to prevent crime from happening in the first place.
Exactly. The book talks about how they've redesigned bus shelters to make them less vulnerable to vandalism. They've created new types of locks that are way harder to pick.
So they're basically using creativity to outsmart criminals, to stay one step ahead.
That's a great way to put it. It's about understanding how criminals think and then designing solutions that anticipate and prevent their actions.
It's like a mental chess game, but the goal is to create a safer world for everyone.
Exactly. And what I love about Design Against Crime is that it goes beyond just catching criminals. It's about creating environments that are safer and more secure for everyone.
It's about designing for the common good.
Absolutely. It's about using creativity to build a better world, one where people feel safe and secure. And this idea of using creativity for good, it goes way beyond crime prevention, you know?
Oh yeah, for sure. The book talks about how creativity can be applied to all sorts of social and environmental challenges, like developing sustainable energy sources, designing more inclusive communities.
There are so many possibilities, and it's up to us to use our creative powers wisely and responsibly.
That's really the takeaway here, isn't it? That creativity is this powerful force. It can be used for good or for bad. And it's our responsibility to make sure we're using it for the right reasons.
Couldn't have said it better myself. We have a choice, and that choice matters.
It's definitely something to think about as we move forward and continue to explore the amazing potential of the creative mind. You know, it's pretty amazing how design can actually be used like that, to prevent crime. It really makes you think about creativity in a whole new way, right?
Yeah, for sure. And the book really emphasizes that this kind of creative problem solving, it's not limited to just crime. It can be applied to all sorts of problems we face, social issues, environmental concerns, you name it.
It's about looking beyond the surface, right?
Yeah.
Thinking outside the box and coming up with innovative solutions.
Exactly. And that's where this whole idea of wisdom comes in, which is something the book keeps coming back to.
So it's not just about creativity for its own sake. It's about creativity that's guided by ethics, by a long-term vision, and by a deep concern for others.
You got it. The book argues that wisdom is what helps us, to navigate those potential downsides of innovation, make sure that what we create is actually contributing to a better world.
So it's like having a moral compass to guide all that creative energy. It's not just about creating something new. It's about creating something good.
Absolutely. It's about thinking about the consequences of our actions, the
Oh,
intended ones and the unintended ones. Like, okay, so what impact is this going to have on other people, on the
mhm.
environment, even on future
No.
generations? It's not about being afraid to take risks or anything like that. It's about being responsible, approaching innovation with a sense of, like, okay, what could go wrong here?
Right. And that sense of responsibility, it extends beyond individuals too.
Yeah.
We need to think about the systems and structures that shape our creative endeavors.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like the book talks about having stronger ethical frameworks in scientific research.
Exactly. Like imagine if scientists and engineers right from the start were encouraged to think about the potential social and environmental impact of their work. So it's like building in safeguards, not to stop progress, but to make sure that progress doesn't come at too high a cost.
That's the idea. And it also brings us to another really important point the book makes, which is about diverse perspectives. Like, what might seem like a brilliant innovation to one person could be a disaster to someone else.
Oh yeah, for sure. Different values,
Hmm.
different priorities. So how do we make sure those different viewpoints are considered, especially when it comes to making decisions about what to create, how to innovate?
Well, the book talks about making those decision-making processes more inclusive, you know,
Yeah.
involving more
So
stakeholders.
not just a bunch of experts in a room, but people who are going to be actually impacted by the innovation.
Exactly. And it's about creating a space for open dialogue, making sure those different voices are heard.
And recognizing that innovation is never neutral. There are always social and ethical dimensions.
Especially with those powerful technologies that are emerging now, artificial intelligence,
Mm,
genetic engineering. We have
yeah.
to be really thoughtful about how we develop and use those.
Yeah. Feels like we're in uncharted territory.
Yeah.
So much potential, but also so many potential pitfalls.
And that's where wisdom becomes even more crucial. It's the compass that can guide us, help us create a future where innovation is actually a force for good.
So where do we go from here? How do we cultivate this wise creativity? Not just in ourselves, but on a larger scale.
Well, the book points to a few key areas: education, mentorship, creating environments that support ethical, responsible innovation.
This is about teaching people to be creative, yeah.
Yeah.
But it's also about helping them develop that moral intelligence, that social intelligence.
Exactly. It's about raising a new generation of innovators who are not only brilliant, but also wise, compassionate, and committed to making the world a better place.
That's a powerful vision, a challenging one too.
For sure. It's going to take all of our creativity, all of our intelligence, and I think most importantly, our wisdom to make that vision a reality.
I think that wraps up our deep dive into the dark side of creativity. We've talked about some pretty complex ideas, explored some pretty dark corners, but I'm actually feeling hopeful. It feels like there's a growing awareness that we need to be more responsible with our innovation.
Yeah, I agree. And I think as we keep exploring this incredible power of the creative mind, we're going to find new ways to harness that power for good.
Great way to put it. Thanks for joining us, everyone. And keep those wheels turning. We need more wise creativity in the world, and who knows, maybe you'll be the one to spark it.